Hey guys, welcome to Mr. Valentin's YouTube video, part 2 of the Canterbury Tales. This is for all the characters post the Wife of Bath. So let's begin and get through these characters and see whatever else is important. This is actually a good picture of the ending of this prologue. Alright, the indication of all the people gathering around for supper. Alright. First up is the Parson. Notice immediately, if you have your textbook located on page 110, how they describe the Parson. A holy-minded man of good renown, there was and poor the Parson to a town. Alright, so the Parson is immediately known as a holy man. Now, of course, we want to think of what his profession is. If you look around line 514 or thereabouts, you'll notice a soiled shepherd and a snowy flock, the true example that a priest should give is one of cleanness, how the sheep should live. Alright, so he is both a shepherd and a priest. It's also important to note about what they say in regards to paying the tithe. So, line 495 and following. For so he proved in great adversity, he much disliked extorting tithe or fee, nay rather he preferred beyond a doubt giving to poor parishioners round about. From his own goods and Easter offerings he found sufficiency in little things. Alright, so first off we have to describe tithing. Alright, what does it mean to tithe? To tithe is to give 10% of your income to the church. And we find out that the parson does not believe in this whatsoever. Alright, he feels that 10% is way too much. That it's beyond reasonable. And that doing nice things for people is more important than paying your tithe. So here again we get a little bit of the social commentary of our story. Kind of the church at this time many people felt was becoming greedy, and that between him and between tithing and having to pay for your sins, it was all a bit much. The next character is the Plowman, and immediately we find out that the Plowman is the Parson's brother. Now, both of these characters come from the lower class, but we also have to note that they are holy lower class. Alright, righteous, as we might say. If you take a look at your picture, you might notice how religious he looks. Alright, it's kind of that robe, and even on his horse it appears almost like a cross. Alright, obviously the plowman's profession is of that of a plowman, so that's not complicated. But again, we find out he's extremely holy. He might be one of the holiest characters in our story. They say that he, quote, loved God best with all his heart and mind, and then his neighbor as himself. Alright, so he loved God and his neighbor. We also find out that he's very helpful. He helps people and doesn't expect to be paid. And he, unlike his brother, pays his tithes. Alright, he goes above and beyond what is expected of his brother. And yet we notice that the plowman comes afterwards. So maybe Chaucer was trying to say something, since we go from a holy person to another holy person, but almost like he's looked down upon because he does pay his tithes. The next character is the miller. The first thing we note is the miller was a chap of 16 stone. And in your book on page 112, they have a note of what 16 stone is. All right, a stone is equivalent to 14 pounds. And so we're finding out that since he weighs 16 stones, he weighs approximately 224 pounds. Basically, he's a big dude. They describe him as stout and big in brawn. Notice what they say about his beard. They say, his beard, like any sow or fox, was red and broad as well. Alright, so he was a redhead. Alright, and they compare him to a fox. And when you think of someone like a fox, you think of someone who is sneaky. So that's important to note, because that's really what we would say about the Miller, is that he's a sneaky, thief-like character. Line 577 or on page 112, of tavern stories filthy in the main, his was a master hand at stealing grain. Alright, so he tells dirty stories. And he's a master at stealing. Alright, he's a thief. The last thing they note, they also show in the picture. Alright, right here. Alright, what we note is he plays the bagpipes. The Manciple is one of our least important characters, if only because there's a very small description, and his actual manuscript in the Canterbury Tales is incomplete, so that's problematic. What a Manciple is, the technical definition, is a person who is in charge of purchasing food for an institution. In the description that they give him, it sounds a bit like he plays the stock market, that he buys stuff low and sells it high. But it's really basically pretty vague about his profession. What we do know from what's little written about him is that he insults the cook. He's not a fan of the cook, which makes sense since they both deal with food. The Reeve is a far more developed character than our other characters. He's a little conflicting because he comes at the end of our story. However, he's also described as somewhat wealthy because he worked with a master who came into some money. We know that at one point he was a carpenter, so we'll certainly take note of that. And from his description, he was a bit of a jack of all trades, almost like he was an apprentice when he was younger. The first thing we note is that they focus on his physical descriptions, that he's old, that he's not this young guy. They describe him as choleric. Choleric is two things. It's sometimes used to describe someone who's very white. It's also used to describe someone who is aggressive or angry. It's actually associated with the four humors. It's associated with the yellow humor. The urine humor, as it were. He's also described as very thin. If we had continued reading the Canterbury Tales, we would find out that his name was actually Oswald. So, fun fact, I guess. We also find out that his stallion, alright, his name is Scott. Alright. So, again, we're going towards this lower class, alright? So his aggression is what makes him an unpleasant character. The next character is the Summoner. What to start with? We'll start with his physical descriptions. If you have your textbook on page 114, Line 641, they say, there was a summoner with us in the place who had a fire-red cherubinicious face, for he had carbuncles, his eyes were narrow, he was hot and lecherous as a sparrow, black scabby brows he had, and a thin beard. Children were afraid when he appeared. Alright, so physically he's not a pleasant-looking fellow. Alright, he has extremely bad acne, which is why they describe his face as red. Such bad acne that he has what are known as carbuncles. And you actually have a note in your textbook on note 78, carbuncles, pus-filled boils resulting from a bacterial infection under the skin. So he's unpleasant. He also has black scabby brows. He's also red because he gets drunk quite often. Notice what they say. This is line 654 and following, or 643 we'll start. And drinking strong wine till all was hazy, then he would shout and jabber as if crazy. Alright, so he would get drunk, and then he'd only speak in Latin. So he was pretty crazy in that regards. He also loved garlic and onions and leeks and other smelly foods. Alright, garlic and onions, leeks. Alright, he's just generally, physically, an unpleasant fellow. It appears from the text, if you note line 665 and following. He was a gentle varlet and a kind one, no better fellow if you want to find one. He would allow just for a quart of wine any good lad to keep a concubine. A concubine often is referred to as either a prostitute or like a second wife. Alright, so if you paid him wine, he would set you up with this second wife. And then later on they say that he would blackmail you for it. So he's a pretty terrible person all around. The last of the low-class characters is the pardoner, and there's so much to say on our said pardoner. We find out that the pardoner is riding with the summoner. So that's important because the summoner wasn't exactly a pleasant person to begin with. They compare him to all sorts of animals. Alright, they describe his hair as yellow as wax. His eyes are bulgy, like a hare. And a hare, of course, is a rabbit. They also describe his hair like that of rat tails. So he's kind of described as this dirty individual. And then the strangest thing occurs is when they describe him as a mare, which is a female horse. And it's here we find out, I guess, shall we say, the sin of the pardoner. That he's probably more than likely a eunuch. That he's been demanded, shall we say. Alright, so there's kind of this strange, forward-thinking peculiarity around him. The other thing they describe him as is a gelding. A gelding is a castrated horse. So it's pretty explicit what's going on with the pardoner. And in his story, he's like drunk, and he volunteers a lot of this information, and it's rather, I guess, shall we say, disturbing. As for his profession, he carries around holy relics, and let's indicate that these holy relics are what we would like to call holy relics, alright, in quotes, that they're not really relics, that they're fakes. And for money, he would sell them, or let people touch them, but they weren't actually what they are. We made that comparison maybe to like the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum or something along those lines. The pardoner, for all intents and purposes, is probably the most sinful man on the list because he's scamming people, he's scamming the church, he's scamming everyone and anyone he can find. We move on to the narrator. I don't have too much to say about the narrator. He's often compared to Geoffrey Chaucer himself, so I would note that. All right, and he is the person who's telling us a story. And he said, "Please don't be offended by what I say. I'm just speaking the truth." Finally, we're left with the host, and the host comes up with basically the idea for the story, the game, as it were. His idea is for everyone to tell 2 stories on the way down and 2 stories on the way back. So everyone is responsible for telling 2 stories going to Canterbury, all right, and then 2 on the return flight back. And this would be a long travel. Remember, it's 55 miles from London, so it's quite the journey, and people are bringing belongings and lots of stuff. And so they all decide to play this game, as it were. And the game is going to result in everyone telling 4 stories, and there's 30 people. So we're supposed to read 120 stories. And the person who tells the best story is going to win a delightful dinner or something along those lines. A dinner where everyone contributes money or brings in food, and so it'll be really, really kind of fun game. All right, and the person who draws the shortest straw is going to be the first person to go. And those are the characters of the Canterbury Tales. It's a lot of characters. All right. A quick thing I want to go over with you. The last thing is direct characterization, indirect characterization, frame, and social commentary. These are your 4 literary terms that you have to know for our test. Direct characterization. Remember, direct characterization is saying something directly about a character. He is tall, he is short, he is mean, he is old, he is choleric, he is thin. Alright, things that are stated directly about the character. Indirect characterization is characterization that uses action, thoughts, or words to describe a character. So, if someone pushes someone down the stairs, right, we can say that about the person who pushed the person down the stairs, that person is not a friendly person. A frame is a story within a story. Basically, every story that you read in the Canterbury Tales is a frame story. In The Wife of Bath's Tale, you have the story that the Wife of Bath is telling, which is within the story of the Canterbury Tales. So there's a frame story right there. But then, to make things even more complicated, there's another story within the story of Midas. So you have a story within a story that's in a story. Alright, so that's a frame narrative, a story within a story. The last bit is social commentary. Remember, social commentary is explaining or showing something about society, using like rhetorical means. Chaucer's basically saying something about society, its values, what it believed in. Alright, so those are the 4 literary terms you have to know. If you have questions about direct characterization or indirect characterization, be sure to ask them at Extra Help. So that's pretty much it. Alright, those are the characters you have to know. So remember, review part 1 of this. This is part 2. Alright, the more you review, the better off you're going to be. Extra Help is always available, so please bother me. And I think that's about it. So good luck studying, good luck reviewing, and if there's questions about The Wife of Bath's Tale, please be sure to watch the YouTube video posted on my website, and ask questions. Alright, stop by, ask questions, etc.